The dress was the color of ripe wheat. Rose had spent 3 nights sewing that fabric by candlelight, hunched over the narrow table in the room she shared with her younger sister, her fingers pricked by the needle, her eyes burning from exhaustion. Every stitch she made was a small promise to herself. Every aligned fold was a silent answer to every time someone had told her she didn't belong in that world. It wasn't a noblewoman's dress. It had no golden thread embroidery, no imported lace from the Northern Territories. But it was honest, well made, and when she looked at herself in the polished metal mirror that night before leaving, she thought she looked beautiful. She thought she was enough. Her sister Petra was 18 years old with eyes too large for her small face, and she had stood behind Rose in that reflection, adjusting the back lacing with careful fingers. "You look like someone they should have always noticed," Petra said quietly. Rose hadn't answered. She'd only pressed her lips together and lifted her chin. The gathering of clans happened once every 2 years at Ironhold Keep, the great stone fortress that sat at the border between 3 territories. Every pack within 2 days' ride sent representatives, alphas, betas, elders, warriors. It was politics dressed as celebration, power disguised as festivity, long tables filled with roasted meat and dark wine, torches burning in iron brackets along walls that had stood for 4 centuries, banners of every pack hanging from the raftered ceiling, their colors swaying gently in the draft that always moved through that ancient hall no matter the season. Rose's pack, the Ashfen, was not a powerful one. They held a modest stretch of forested land to the east, their numbers modest, their alpha, a broad, aging man named Crest, more concerned with keeping peace than expanding influence. They came to gatherings not to negotiate power, but to avoid losing what little they had. Rose had come for a different reason. His name was Edmund. He was a beta of the Ashfen pack, broad-shouldered and fair-haired, with the easy smile that had once made her stomach turn warm. They had known each other since childhood, grown up running the same forest paths, eating at the same communal fires. 2 years ago, at the last gathering, he had pulled her aside beneath the old oak that grew against the eastern wall of the keep, and told her, with his hand over hers, that he would make it official at the next one. "At the next gathering," he'd said, in front of everyone. "I want them all to see." She had held those words for 2 years like something fragile and precious. She had not spoken of them to many people. Only Petra knew the full weight of what that promise had meant to her, what it would mean for a woman of her standing to be publicly claimed by a man the pack respected. It would not make her noble, but it would make her seen. She walked into Ironhold Keep that night with her wheat-colored dress and her carefully braided hair, and the quiet dignity of someone who had decided not to be afraid. The great hall smelled of burning resin, tallow candles, roasted boar, and beneath it all, the layered animal warmth of dozens of wolves gathered in one space. Leather and pine sap, and something darker, muskier, that always reminded her the men and women filling these halls were not entirely human, not even close. She found it grounding rather than threatening. It was the smell of her world, for better or worse. Petra stayed close to her side as they entered, her small hand briefly touching Rose's elbow. "He's already here," Petra murmured, near the Ashfen table. Rose spotted him easily. Edmund stood with 2 other betas from their pack, a cup in hand, laughing at something one of them had said. He was well dressed tonight, a dark tunic, a new cloak. Someone had oiled his boots. He didn't look her way when she entered. She told herself that meant nothing. The hall was crowded. The noise was considerable. She moved toward the Ashfen table with her head level and her hands relaxed at her sides. And she did not hurry, and she did not look over her shoulder. An hour passed, then another. Edmund spoke to her twice during that time, once to compliment her dress with a vague, distracted smile, and once to ask if she had seen where Elder Marin had sat. Both times he moved away before she could say much in return. Both times she watched the back of his cloak retreat into the crowd and felt the first cold thread of something unraveling in her chest. It was Petra who saw it first. She appeared at Rose's side with a face carefully arranged to show nothing, which meant everything. Petra only went expressionless like that when she was protecting someone from information they weren't going to want. "Rose," she said carefully, "I already know something's wrong. His mother arrived an hour ago." Petra paused. She brought the Caldwell girl with her, Mira Caldwell, from the northern branch of their family. They've been sitting with Edmund since. Rose turned slowly and looked across the hall. Edmund was seated now, at a table slightly apart from the Ashvin group, and beside him, close beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his, sat a young woman Rose didn't recognize, dark-haired, finely dressed. His mother sat across from them both, her expression the satisfied stillness of a woman watching something she had arranged fall into place. As Rose watched, Edmund leaned toward the dark-haired woman and said something that made her laugh. He didn't look up. Not once. Rose stood very still for a long moment. Around her, the hall continued its noise. Laughter, the scrape of benches, the clink of cups, a group of warriors near the far wall raising their voices in some competitive argument. The world didn't stop. It never did. She felt the weight of the wheat-colored dress. 3 nights of candlelight. Fingers pricked by needles. 2 years of a promise held carefully, like something fragile. She set down her cup on the nearest table, quietly, without a sound. "I'm going to get some air," she told Petra, and her voice came out level, which she was grateful for. "Rose, I'm fine." She wasn't, but she would be. She knew herself well enough to know the difference between falling apart and needing a moment to decide not to. "Stay here. I won't be long." She turned and walked toward the side corridor that led to the keep's eastern passage, a longer route to the outer doors, but one that would take her away from the main tables, away from Edmund and his mother and the dark-haired woman sitting so comfortably at his side. She had almost reached the corridor's mouth when the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Not the main doors, the high doors, the ones that led from the upper courtyard, reserved by old custom for the highest-ranking arrivals, the doors through which pack kings and territorial lords entered when they chose to make their presence felt. Rose didn't stop walking. Whatever entrance was happening behind her was not her concern tonight. She had her own quiet exit to manage, her own dignity to collect before it frayed any further. But the hall went noticeably quieter, not silent, just quieter, the way a room shifts when something with real weight enters it. She kept her pace steady. Corridor, eastern passage, fresh air. One thing at a time. She had just stepped into the shadow of the corridor's mouth when she heard a voice, low, unhurried, carrying the particular texture of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "Someone tell me why there's a woman walking away from this hall like she's the only sane one here." She didn't turn around, but she stopped. Rose stood at the edge of the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. She counted them, because counting gave her something to do other than react. The hall had shifted in that particular way again. That collective, involuntary stillness that a room full of wolves produces when something at the top of the hierarchy moves through it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something older than fear. Something written into the body before language existed. She turned around slowly. There were 3 of them. They had entered through the high doors and now stood at the threshold of the great hall in a loose formation that managed to look both casual and completely deliberate. The kind of casual that takes real power to produce, the ease of men who had never once in their lives needed to prove they belonged somewhere. The one on the left was tall and broad, with a warrior's build and a grin that suggested he found most of the world mildly entertaining. He was already scanning the room with bright, sharp eyes, the way a man does when he's cataloging exits and interesting people in equal measure. His cloak was dark red, pinned at the shoulder with a silver clasp shaped like a crescent moon. The one in the middle was leaner, with dark copper skin and an expression of refined amusement, the kind of man who made observations and kept most of them to himself, releasing them only when the timing was precisely right. He held a cup he'd apparently picked up from somewhere in the last 30 seconds, and he was already drinking from it with the comfortable ownership of someone who considered everything within reach to be available to him. The one on the right said nothing. He was the reason the room had gone quiet. Rose recognized him the way you recognize a storm before it arrives. Not by seeing it directly, but by the way the air changes around it. He was not the largest of the three, though he was tall. He was not the most visibly armed, though something about the way he stood suggested that weapons were a courtesy. He extended to the concept of fairness rather than a necessity. He had dark hair, sharp-cut features, and the kind of stillness that isn't emptiness but rather the opposite. A profound, watchful fullness, like deep water that shows nothing on the surface because everything is happening underneath. Theron, king of the Ardenvale Pack. The largest unified territory in the northern reaches. A man whose name was used in political conversations the way weather was used in farming conversations, as the primary variable around which everything else was planned. Rose had never been in the same room as him before. She became aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, that he was looking directly at her. Not at the hall. Not at the assembled packs with their politics and their posturing. At her. At the woman standing half in, half out of a side corridor in a wheat-colored dress with her jaw set and her eyes bright with something she was working very hard to keep contained. The tall one with the red cloak, she would learn later his name was Gareth, the king's youngest brother, leaned toward Theron and said something low enough that it didn't carry. Theron didn't respond. He kept looking at her with the patient, direct attention of someone who had asked a question and was waiting for the answer to arrive in its own time. Rose made a decision. She turned back toward the corridor and walked. Behind her, she heard the tall one make a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. The eastern passage was dim and cool, lit by torches spaced widely enough that shadows pooled between them. Rose walked its length with measured steps, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing deliberate. The stone floor was uneven underfoot, old, worn smooth in the center by centuries of boots. The walls were thick enough to muffle the hall noise to a low, distant rumble. She came out into a small courtyard on the keep's eastern side. It was used for storage, barrels stacked against one wall, a cart with a broken wheel pushed to the side, coils of rope hanging from iron hooks. A single torch burned above the outer door. The night air was cold and smelled of damp earth and pine from the forest beyond the walls. Rose stopped in the center of the courtyard, tilted her head back, and looked at the sky. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. She kept that promise. But she allowed herself, in the privacy of that empty courtyard, to feel the full weight of it. The 2 years, the needle-pricked fingers, the wheat-colored dress, the way Edmund had leaned toward that dark-haired woman and not once looked up to find her face across the room. She was 23 years old. She was standing alone in a storage courtyard at the gathering of clans because the man she had trusted had made a promise he never intended to keep, and his mother had arrived with a better option, and that was simply that. The world was not cruel about it. It was something worse, indifferent. She pressed her fingers briefly against her sternum, like she was checking that something was still in place. Then she lowered her hand and straightened her back. Enough, she told herself. That's enough of that. She would go back inside. She would find Petra. She would sit at the Ashfen table and eat something and speak to people and perform, with competence, the role of a woman who was perfectly fine. She was good at that. She had practice. She turned toward the door. It opened before she reached it. The man who stepped through was the copper-skinned one from the trio, the lean one with the expression of refined amusement. Up close, he was younger than she'd thought, perhaps 28, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of face that probably made people underestimate him regularly, which she suspected he found useful. He stopped when he saw her. Then the amusement deepened slightly, like something had confirmed a theory he'd been developing. "Ah," he said. "So you came this way?" Rose looked at him steadily. "This courtyard is for keep storage, not for guests." Profoundly true. He glanced around at the barrels and the broken cart. "And yet, here we both are." He extended a hand, not in the formal pack greeting, just an ordinary introduction. "Cale. I'm usually described as the diplomatic one, which should tell you something about the other two." She didn't take the hand immediately. "Why did you follow me?" "I didn't, technically. Theron sent me to make sure you hadn't actually left the keep entirely." He tilted his head. He was concerned. "He doesn't know me." "No," Cale agreed pleasantly. "But he noticed you. Those are different things. But he seems to find the second one sufficient for now." Rose studied him. He was telling the truth. She could feel it. The way wolves always could with each other when the lie wasn't carefully constructed. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't executing some elaborate social maneuver on behalf of his king. He was simply a man who had been sent to check on a woman, and was doing so with more honesty than the situation probably required. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I just needed air. I'll tell him that." "You don't need to tell him anything. I'm not his concern." Cale's mouth curved. "You might want to let him know that. He's formed a different opinion in approximately the last 4 minutes, and Theron's opinions tend to be—" He paused, considering, durable. Rose opened her mouth to respond. The door opened again. Gareth, the broad one with the red cloak, filled the doorway with his considerable shoulders, and looked between the two of them with bright, entertained eyes. "Cale, he's done waiting." "I've been here less than 2 minutes." "Yes. And he's been standing in that corridor for both of them, which means he's done waiting." Gareth looked at Rose with open, uncomplicated curiosity. "You're the one from the Ashvin pack." "Yes. The beta who was supposed to claim you tonight chose someone else." Rose felt the words land. They were blunt, but not unkind, the matter-of-fact directness of someone who considered pretending not to know things to be a waste of everyone's time. "That seems to be the situation," she said evenly. Gareth nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something. "And instead of making a scene, you walked out quietly." "I didn't want to make a scene. Most people would have." He looked at her for another moment, assessing, then smiled, broad and genuine and slightly wolfish. "Theron wants to speak with you. I don't know why he would. Neither do I, completely. But he's never wrong about this kind of thing, so—" He stepped aside from the doorway and gestured back toward the corridor. An invitation, not a command. The difference mattered, and she noticed he was aware of that. Rose stood still for a moment longer. The night air was cold against the back of her neck. The torch above the door threw warm light across the stone. Inside, behind the distant rumble of the hall, was a man who had looked at her across a crowded room and then sent people to find her, not because she was important to anyone in that building, but because something had caught his attention, and he was not the kind of man who ignored things that caught his attention. She thought of Edmund leaning toward the dark-haired woman. She thought of 3 nights of candlelight and needle-pricked fingers. Then she stepped forward, through the door, back into the warmth of the corridor. Gareth fell into step beside her, and Cale came from behind, and the 3 of them moved through the stone passage toward the place where the hall noise grew louder and the torchlight grew brighter, and where, at the corridor's end, a man stood waiting with the unhurried stillness of someone who had already decided the wait was worth it. Theron looked at her when she came into the light. He said nothing. Not yet. But his eyes were the color of deep amber in the torchlight, and they did not move from her face, and something in the quality of that attention, patient, serious, entirely without performance, made the cold thing that had settled in her chest since Edmund turned away shift, almost imperceptibly, like a stone moved by water. She met his gaze and did not look away. Nobody had ever looked at her quite like that. Rose had been looked at with pity, with indifference, with the particular brand of dismissal that men of higher standing reserved for women of lower ones, a glance that measured and found insufficient without ever really seeing. She knew all of those looks. She had catalogued them over 23 years the way one catalogues weather patterns, not because she enjoyed the inventory, but because knowing what was coming helped her prepare for it. This was none of those things. Theron looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't yet have a word for, carefully, without rushing toward a conclusion, with the patient attention of someone who considers accuracy more important than speed. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was not unkind. It was simply, profoundly direct. "Rose," he said. Not a question. He already knew her name, which meant he had asked someone in the time between her leaving the hall and her returning to this corridor. That small fact settled into her mind and stayed there. "My lord," she said. The formal address felt strange in her mouth. She was not accustomed to using it, not accustomed to standing this close to someone who warranted it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement of one. "Theron," he said. "That's sufficient." Behind her, she heard Gareth make a small sound. She got the impression this was not how Theron typically introduced himself to people. "Theron," she repeated, and found it fit better. He studied her for another moment, then turned and began walking down the corridor. Not away from her, but alongside the assumption that she would walk with him, which was different from demanding it. She fell into step beside him. Cale and Gareth dropped back, giving distance without disappearing entirely, performing the particular skill of men who had learned when their presence should be felt and when it should simply be available. "You're from the Ashfin Pack," Theron said. His voice in the corridor was easier to track than it had been across the great hall. Low, unhurried, the cadence of someone who chose words with care and didn't fill silence for its own sake. "Yes." "Modest territory, Eastern Forest, near the Greywood border. You know it?" "I know most territories within 2 days' ride of Ironhold." A pause. "I make it my business to." She believed that entirely. "Then you know we're not significant." "Significance depends on what you're measuring." He glanced at her sideways, brief, assessing. "What's your role in the Ashfin Pack?" It was a simple enough question, but it landed with unexpected weight, because the honest answer was not a proud one. "I help manage the communal stores. I assist the elder women during injuries or illness. I teach the younger ones to track and read weather." She kept her voice level. "I don't have a formal rank." "Why not?" "Because formal ranks in my pack go to people with bloodlines that warrant them." "And yours doesn't?" She met his sideways glance directly. "My mother was a seamstress. My father left before I could walk. I grew up in the Ashfin territory because Elder Marin took my mother in when she had nowhere else to go." She paused. "So, no. My bloodline doesn't warrant much, by the measures my pack uses." Theron was quiet for a moment. They had reached a place in the corridor where a narrow window opened onto the outer courtyard. Not the storage yard she'd been in, but the main approach, where torches burned in a long line along the wall, and the cold night air moved through the stone gap with a sound like quiet breathing. He stopped. She stopped beside him. "You stayed," he said. "I'm sorry?" "Tonight." He was looking out the window, his profile sharp in the torchlight. "When the beta made his choice, you didn't argue. You didn't demand explanation in front of the hall. You left quietly." He turned to look at her again. "Why?" Rose considered lying, considered saying something composed and dignified about choosing one's battles or preserving pack harmony. Decided against it. "Because making a scene wouldn't have changed anything," she said. He made his choice. His mother arranged it and he allowed it, which tells me everything I needed to know about who he is. She paused, and because I wasn't going to let him see me break, the amber eyes held hers for a long moment. That took more strength than most people in that hall possess, he said quietly, not a compliment delivered for effect. An observation stated as plainly as a fact about weather. Rose felt something in her chest pull tight, and then, carefully, loosen. It didn't feel like strength, she admitted, which surprised her. She hadn't meant to say that part aloud. It rarely does, Theron said. That's usually how you know it's real. They stood at the window for a moment in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of space rather than absence, room for something to exist without being named yet. Then Gareth appeared at the end of the corridor with the expression of a man delivering news he found personally satisfying. Hall's moving to the second table setting. Food's going out. He looked at Rose. Theron's table has room. Rose looked at Theron. You haven't eaten, he said simply. I can sit with my own pack. You can, he agreed. There was no argument in it, no pressure. Just the plainly offered alternative hanging in the air between them, waiting for her to do with it what she chose. She thought of the Ashfin table. She thought of the particular quality of sympathy that would be on the faces of people who had seen what happened tonight. The careful avoidance of the subject, the slightly too loud conversations about other things, the way Crest would look at her with that heavy, helpless expression he got when he knew something in his pack had gone wrong and didn't know how to fix it. She thought of sitting at a table where the most powerful man in the Northern Territories had set a place and said, without theater or pity, that there was room. All right, she said. Theron nodded once, as if this had always been the natural outcome, and turned back toward the hall. The great hall looked different when she re-entered it from the corridor side, at the edge of the Ardenvale table, rather than the Ashfan one. Or perhaps it was she who was different. The angle of approach, the company alongside her, the way the room's attention moved in a subtle wave when Theron returned to his seat, and it registered, by the small mechanisms of pack instinct, where he had been and who had come back with him. She felt eyes. She kept her chin level. Petra found her within minutes. Rose spotted her sister threading between tables with wide eyes and the particular expression of someone trying very hard to look calm, while their internal state was the opposite. Petra stopped at the edge of the Ardenvale table, looked at Rose, looked at the seat beside Theron, looked back at Rose. Rose gave her the smallest possible nod. I'm all right. I'll explain later. Petra's eyes were enormous, but she nodded back and retreated to the Ashfin table, and Rose understood that her sister would guard that information with her life, and also probably not sleep until she had the full account. The meal was served. The Ardenvale table was not loud. It had none of the competitive noise of the lesser packs working to establish themselves. It had the ease of people who had nothing to prove, and it produced a particular kind of quiet confidence that Rose found, unexpectedly, restful. Gareth ate with enthusiasm, and periodically made observations about the other tables that were sharp enough to be insightful, and irreverent enough to be entertaining. Cale said little, but listened to everything, and once or twice caught Rose's eye with an expression that suggested he was updating his assessment of her in real time and finding the results satisfactory. Theron ate with the same unhurried attention he gave everything else. He spoke when something warranted speech. He did not perform. Midway through the meal, he turned to her and said quietly, so only she could hear, "The beta, Edmund." Her hand stilled briefly on her cup. "Yes. He's watching this table." She didn't look. She didn't need to. "I know. Does it bother you?" She considered the question honestly. "It would have bothered me more an hour ago," she said. "Before..." She stopped. "Before what?" She looked at him directly. "Before I understood that his opinion of my worth was never the measure I should have been using." Something shifted in Theron's expression. It was subtle, the slight deepening of attention, the way a man looks when he hears something that lands in a place he didn't expect. He said nothing, but he held her gaze for a moment longer than was casual, and when he reached for his cup, his hand passed close enough to hers on the table that she felt the warmth of it without contact. A proximity that was not accidental, and not yet anything more than what it was. She turned back to her food. Her heart was doing something she didn't entirely trust. Across the hall, at the Ashfin table, Edmund was indeed watching. She could feel it the way you feel a draft through a cracked shutter, a cold, distant awareness at the edge of her attention. She did not look at him. She ate her meal at the Ardenvale table and listened to Gareth say something that made Cale press his mouth flat to suppress a response, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, he made his choice, and now I'm making mine. The night was not over. The gathering would continue for 2 more days. There were politics unresolved, alliances in negotiation, old tensions simmering between packs who shared contested borders. Rose did not yet know what any of it would mean for her. But the wheat-colored dress, which had seemed so insufficient 3 hours ago, felt different now. Not because anything about it had changed, because she had. The second day of the gathering began with frost. Rose woke before dawn in the small room she shared with Petra in the keep's lower guest quarters. A stone cell with 2 narrow beds, a wash basin, and a single high window through which the cold came in steadily regardless of the wooden shutter latched across it. She lay still for a moment, listening to Petra's breathing and the distant sounds of the keep waking. Boots on stone corridors, the clank of kitchen preparations, a dog barking somewhere in the outer yard. Then she got up, washed her face in water that made her breath catch, and began braiding her hair with the careful attention of someone who had decided, sometime between falling asleep and waking, that today required more precision than yesterday. Petra woke while she was finishing. "Tell me everything," her sister said immediately, sitting up with her blanket around her shoulders and her hair in complete disorder. "From the beginning, leave nothing out," Rose told her. Not everything, not the window in the corridor, not the exact quality of the silence that had existed between herself and Theron in certain moments, but enough. Enough that Petra sat with increasingly wide eyes and an expression that cycled through shock, indignation on Rose's behalf regarding Edmund, and something that was trying very hard not to be giddy excitement. "He set a place at his table," Petra said when Rose finished. "He mentioned there was room. Rose, that is not a casual thing. That is—" Petra stopped, reconsidered, continued at a lower volume. "He is the Alpha King of Ardenvale. He does not mention that there is room at his table to women he has no interest in. You don't know that. I absolutely know that." Petra looked at her with the specific expression of a younger sister who believes she is being more clear-eyed about a situation than the person actually in it. "What does he smell like?" Rose paused, her hands on the end of her braid. It was not an insignificant question among wolves. Scent was information. Layered, complex, nearly impossible to falsify. Every wolf carried their own, shaped by bloodline and health and emotion, and something deeper than either. Something that operated below the level of conscious choice. You could learn a great deal about a person from how their scent registered in your body. Whether it made you calm or alert. Whether it felt like a warning or something else entirely. Theron smelled like iron and dark cedar and cold running water, and, underneath all of it, something older. Something her instincts didn't have a ready category for. Something that had made a quiet, animal part of her sit up and pay close attention every time he came within a few feet of her. "Like someone you should take seriously," Rose said, which was true, and also a careful omission of everything else. Petra looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, small, knowing, deeply satisfied, and said nothing more about it. The morning session of the gathering was given over to territorial negotiations. Long, formal discussions between pack elders and alphas in the keep's council chamber, which Rose had no standing to attend. She spent the first part of the morning helping Elder Marin with a minor dispute between two Ashvin members who had managed to insult a family from the Western Caldwell pack the night before, a situation requiring careful and patient diplomacy that Rose was better at than most people gave her credit for. She was good at reading people. She always had been. Not in the dramatic way the old stories talked about. No visions. No supernatural clarity. But in the ordinary accumulated way of someone who had spent years in a low position, watching, listening, learning the difference between what people said and what they meant. It was during this mediation, in a small anteroom off the main corridor, that Edmund found her. He appeared in the doorway while she was speaking quietly to the elder, and she saw him over Marin's shoulder and felt her body make a small, involuntary adjustment, not flinching exactly, but the internal equivalent of bracing. She finished her sentence to Marin, then turned to face him. Edmund looked like a man who had not slept well. His fair hair was less carefully arranged than it had been the night before, and there was something tight around his eyes that hadn't been there before. A discomfort that she recognized with distant clarity, as the specific unease of someone who has made a choice and is now watching its consequences take shape in a form they hadn't anticipated. "A word," he said. Marin looked at Rose. Rose nodded slightly, and the elder moved to the far end of the room with the tact of someone who would hear every word anyway, and simply chose not to acknowledge it. Edmund stepped into the room. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between regret and defensiveness, which was, she thought, a very honest portrait of a man who knew he had done wrong, but had not yet decided how much of that wrongness to own. "Last night," he began. "You don't need to explain," Rose said. She kept her voice even. "Your family had expectations. You met them. That's a choice you were always going to make. I just didn't understand that until it was in front of me." Edmund's jaw tightened. "It wasn't simple. I know it wasn't." She meant that. She did not think him a villain. She thought him a man who had chosen the path of least resistance when it mattered, which was its own kind of answer. But you made a promise 2 years ago that you knew you might not keep, and you let me keep believing in it, rather than tell me the truth. That's the part that was simple. You chose not to." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw you," he said then, "at the Ardenvale table." "Yes." "With Theron." He said the name carefully, like it had weight. "Rose, you don't know that world. Those men, that pack. It's not what you think. The politics alone. Edmund." Her voice was quiet, but very clear. "You don't get to spend 2 years not choosing me and then warn me about who else I speak to." The silence that followed was complete. He looked at her, really looked, for perhaps the first time since she'd arrived at the gathering. And she watched him see something in her face that he hadn't expected. Something that had changed. Something that made the expression behind his eyes shift into something she thought might be the beginning of genuine understanding, arriving too late to be useful. "I'm sorry," he said finally, quietly, without defense. It was the right thing to say. It didn't fix anything, but it was the right thing, and she gave him credit for it. "I know," she said. "Goodbye, Edmund." She walked past him and out of the room, and her hands were completely steady, and she did not look back. She found Theron unexpectedly. She had not been looking for him. She had been crossing the keep's inner yard toward the eastern walkway, wanting cold air and open sky for a few minutes after the anteroom conversation, and she came around the corner of the stone archway and nearly walked into Cale, who was standing beside a wooden post with his arms folded, apparently waiting for something. Theron was 12 feet away in the open yard, doing something she had not expected. He was with a child. A small girl, perhaps 6 or 7, who belonged to one of the southern pack families. Rose recognized the colors of her cloak. The girl had apparently lost something, and was explaining this to Theron with the complete seriousness of someone for whom the lost object was of paramount importance. Theron had crouched down to her level, which put the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories in a genuinely undignified physical position, and he was listening to her with the same focused, patient attention he gave everything else. Rose stopped. Cale glanced at her arrival and said nothing, which she was grateful for. She watched Theron listen to the girl, watched him ask a question, watched the girl point toward the far corner of the yard, watched him stand and walk with her to look, and watched him crouch again by the base of the wall and retrieve, from between two stones, a small carved wooden figure, a wolf by the look of it, which he handed back to the girl with the gravity of a man returning something of genuine value. The girl clutched it and said something that made Theron's expression do a thing Rose hadn't seen before. A full, unguarded smile, real and sudden, that changed his face completely and lasted only a moment before settling back into its usual composed lines. The girl ran off. Theron straightened, turned, and found Rose standing at the archway. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You were watching," he said. Not an accusation. "I came around the corner," she said. "I didn't want to interrupt." He crossed the yard toward her with the unhurried stride that seemed to be his natural speed for everything. Cale made himself scarce with practiced ease. "How are you this morning?" Theron said, when he was close enough that the question was private. "Better than last night," she said honestly. "I spoke to Edmund." Something sharpened slightly in his expression. "And it's finished." She looked at him steadily. "It was finished before it happened, honestly. I just needed to say it out loud." Theron studied her face for a moment. Then he said, "Walk with me." They walked the eastern walkway as the frost melted from the stone under the morning sun, and he told her, gradually and without apparent agenda, about Ardenvale, about the territory, the pack, the way it was structured, not as a sales proposition, more like someone showing a person something real, without ornament, trusting them to form their own conclusions. She listened. She asked questions. He answered them directly, without the political softening she had expected from a man of his position. And at a certain point, on a walkway above the keep's outer wall with the forest spread dark and green below them, and the cold air carrying the sharp smell of pine and distant rain, he stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want you to come to Ardenvale," he said. Rose went still. "Not as—" He paused, choosing words with his usual care. "Not as anything you don't choose. I'm not asking you to decide everything today. I'm asking you to consider it, to see the territory, to see whether what I believe about you is something you recognize in yourself." "What do you believe about me?" she asked quietly. His amber eyes were steady on hers. "That you've been in the wrong place," he said, "for a very long time." The forest below them moved in a slow wind. Somewhere in the keep behind them, the gathering continued its politics, and its negotiations, and its noise. Rose stood on the walkway with the Alpha King of Ardenvale and felt, beneath her feet, the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something. Not a cliff, not a fall, but a threshold. A door. One she had not known existed until 3 days ago, and which was now standing open. She did not answer him yet, but she did not look away. She gave him her answer that evening, not in a grand moment, not in front of the assembled packs with their banners and their politics and their carefully watched hierarchies. She found him in the corridor outside the council chamber after the final session of the day had closed, when the keep was settling into the quieter register of late afternoon and the long tables were being reset for the evening meal. And she said, simply and directly, "Yes, I'll come to Ardenvale." Theron looked at her for a moment, with that focused, unhurried attention. Then he nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already understood, but had waited for her to arrive at herself. "We leave the day after tomorrow," he said. "After the gathering closes. I'll need to speak to Elder Marin, and to Petra." "Of course." She paused. "Petra comes with me." Something in his expression acknowledged this without resistance. "There's room." She recognized the words from 2 nights ago, from a different context, and thought she saw the faintest awareness of the echo in his eyes. She said nothing about it, but she carried it with her as she turned and went to find her sister. Petra cried. Not from sadness. Rose was clear on that point immediately, because she knew her sister's crying and could distinguish between its varieties with precision. This was the overwhelmed kind, the kind that came when something you had hoped for someone you loved arrived in a form larger than you had let yourself imagine. "You're sure?" Petra said, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and then immediately looking embarrassed about it. "I'm sure about going," Rose said carefully. "I'm not sure about everything else, but I'm sure about going." "That's enough," Petra decided, with the practical certainty of someone who had just recalibrated their expectations to match reality and found it more than sufficient. That's more than enough. Elder Marin was harder. The old woman received Rose's news in the small room she occupied in the keep's upper quarters, seated in a chair by the window with a cup of something warm between her weathered hands. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Rose had always respected about her. When Rose finished, Marin was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the darkening sky. "You know what you're walking into," the elder said finally. It was not quite a question. "I know the outline of it, not the details." "The details are where the difficulty lives." Marin turned to look at her. Her eyes were old and very clear. "Ardenvale is not Ashfin. The pack is large, the politics are complex, and the man who leads it carries weight that most people only see from a distance." She paused. "Are you going because of what you're moving toward, or because of what you're leaving behind?" Rose had thought about this. She had thought about it during the walk back from the Eastern Walkway, during the conversation with Petra, in the quiet moments between. It was the right question. It deserved an honest answer. "Both," she said, "but mostly toward." Marin studied her for a long moment. Then she set down her cup, reached out, and took Rose's hand between both of hers. A gesture Rose had received from her perhaps 3 times in her entire life, each time marking something the elder considered significant. "Your mother would have been proud of you," Marin said quietly. "She was proud of you. She just didn't always know how to say it." Rose's throat tightened. She held the elder's hands and said nothing, because nothing was needed. "Go," Marin said, releasing her. "Go and be what you actually are, instead of what this place had room for." The gathering closed on the 3rd morning with the traditional exchange of pack seals, small wax impressions pressed into a shared document that meant, in practical terms, very little, and in symbolic terms, everything. Crest signed for the Ashfin pack with his broad, careful hand. Theron signed for Ardenvale last, with the easy authority of a man who had done this many times and found the ceremony meaningful rather than tedious. Edmund was present for the closing ceremony. Rose was aware of him the way she was aware of weather, as a condition of the environment rather than a focal point. He stood with his family, near the back of the Ashfin contingent, and she felt his attention on her once or twice during the proceedings. She did not look at him, not from cruelty, simply because there was nothing more to say, and she had finished that conversation 2 days ago in an anteroom with a steadiness that still surprised her when she thought about it. She stood with Petra near the Ardenvale contingent, which was where Theron had indicated she would travel, and she felt the small seismic adjustment of the room when people registered this. The quiet recalibration of assessments, the careful noting of positions. She was aware of what it meant to be standing where she was standing. She was not naive about it. She was also not afraid of it. When the ceremony ended, and the hall began its organized dissolution, packs gathering their people and their belongings for the journey home, Gareth appeared at her left, with a large, genuine smile, and the air of a man who was deeply satisfied with how things had turned out. "The Eastern Road is good this time of year," he said. 2 days to Ardenvale if the weather holds. Cale will complain about the pace regardless. He paused. "Welcome, by the way. Officially." "Thank you," she said. "Officially." He laughed, full and easy, and she found, to her mild surprise, that she liked him. She thought she might like all three of them, in their different registers. The thought was strange and warm, and she let herself have it without qualification. Cale materialized on her right. "I've already arranged the carriage order," he said. "You and your sister will travel comfortably. I've also taken the liberty of ensuring that the overnight stop will have adequate accommodation, unlike the last gathering journey, during which Gareth managed to secure us lodging that I can only describe as... It had a roof," Gareth said. "It had most of a roof." Rose looked between them and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been held tightly for a long time, far longer than 3 days, perhaps for years. The careful bracing, the managed expectation, the habit of making herself small enough to fit the space she'd been given. She let it go. Not all at once, but she let it begin. The Ardenvale column departed Ironhold Keep as the morning mist was still burning off the stones, the horse's breath visible in the cold air, the pack's banners, dark green and iron gray, moving in the light wind above the column's head. Rose rode in the second carriage with Petra, who had been silently processing the last 3 days at increasing speed and was now, apparently, ready to talk. "His smile," Petra said, as the keep's walls receded behind them. "When he looks at you, does he know he does that? Does he know he does what? That thing, with his expression, where it..." Petra made a gesture that Rose found unhelpfully vague. "Changes. I don't know what you're describing." "Yes, you do." Rose looked out the carriage window at the forest moving past, the pine trees dense and dark and familiar in the way that the natural world always was, regardless of what was happening among the people moving through it. The road was good. The air smelled of cold earth and pine resin, and faintly, on the edge of her awareness, dark cedar and iron and cold running water. She said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved. Petra saw it, and said nothing either, which was the most generous thing she could have done. They arrived at Ardenvale as the second day's light was failing, coming through the forest road and out suddenly into open ground, and Rose saw it for the first time. The great hall and its outbuildings rising above the tree line, lit from within, the lights warm against the darkening sky, the walls older than anything she had grown up near, the Ardenvale banners moving slowly above the main gate. It was large. It was very large. It smelled of many wolves, many lives, accumulated time. It smelled, underneath all of it, like him. Theron rode to the carriage as they passed through the gate and pulled alongside the window. She looked up at him from the carriage interior, and he looked down at her from the horse, and there was a moment of simple recognition between them, the acknowledgement that they had arrived, and that this was real, and that what came next was not yet named but was present and serious and mutual. "Welcome to Ardenvale," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for the place at the table." His mouth curved. "The place was always there," he said. "It was just waiting for the right person." She held his gaze. Around them the pack moved and settled and went about the business of returning home, and the lights burned warm in the old stone walls, and Petra made a small, carefully suppressed sound beside her. Rose stepped out of the carriage onto the stones of Ardenvale's inner yard, and the ground felt solid beneath her feet, and she thought, "This is real. I'm here. I chose this." In the weeks that followed, she learned the pack. She learned its rhythms and its people and its complicated, layered history. She found her footing slowly, and then with increasing confidence, and the pack, cautious at first, as packs always were with newcomers, began to recognize in her what Theron had seen from across a crowded hall, a woman of uncommon steadiness, uncommon perception, and a quality of quiet authority that had simply never had the right conditions to grow before. Petra found her place too. She was younger and louder, and made friends faster than Rose had ever managed. And within a month, she had inserted herself into the social fabric of Ardenvale with the cheerful inevitability of someone who had simply decided to belong and waited for the world to catch up. Theron and Rose moved toward each other the way two careful things move, slowly, with attention, without pretending certainty they didn't yet have. He chose her, consciously and repeatedly, in the small ways that matter more than grand gestures. Asking her opinion in council, ensuring she had what she needed, being present in the particular way that means I see you rather than I am watching you. She chose him back in the same register, with trust extended gradually, with honesty that sometimes surprised him, with the willingness to stay in the room when things were difficult rather than retreating to manage distance. It was not without difficulty. She was a woman without formal rank entering a powerful pack, and not everyone received her without question. There were challenges, political and personal, that required patience and steadiness, and the specific courage of someone who had decided she was no longer willing to be invisible, but had also never sought to be a spectacle. She met each one. Not perfectly, but honestly. And Theron was there, not solving things for her, but present in the way that matters. The way that says, I believe in your ability to handle this, and I am here regardless. There came a morning, some months after Ironhold, when she stood in the great hall of Ardenvale in her proper place, a place that was now genuinely hers, acknowledged and real, and understood, quietly and completely, that she had stopped waiting to be sent back, stopped holding the experience at arm's length as though it might be rescinded, stopped carrying the ghost of a wheat-colored dress and needle-pricked fingers as evidence of what she had once been willing to settle for. She was home. The word arrived without announcement and settled into her chest with the simple weight of something true. That evening, Theron found her on the eastern walkway of the Ardenvale Hall. She had a preference for eastern walkways, she had discovered, and he had apparently noted this, and stood beside her in the cold air looking out over the forest, the same way they had stood at Ironhold above the trees. You're quiet tonight, he said. I'm thinking. About? She considered how to say it, then decided the direct version was the right one, because it usually was, between them. About how strange it is to get what you didn't know you needed. I spent 2 years hoping for something that wasn't right for me. And then I came to a gathering in a dress I made myself, and a man I had no reason to trust offered me a place at his table, and she paused. Here I am. Theron looked at her. In the low light, his eyes were very amber, very steady. Here you are, he said quietly. He reached out and took her hand on the stone railing. Not dramatically, not with performance, simply with the ease of someone doing something that belongs. She let him. She turned her hand to hold his back. The forest moved below them in the night wind, dark and ancient and indifferent to the small human moments happening above it, which were not small at all. There was one thing Rose did not yet know. It would come to her gradually, in pieces. A comment from Elder Voss, the Ardenvale pack historian, who had looked at her during a council meeting with an expression she couldn't quite read. A question Cale had asked once, almost in passing, about her mother's family name and where they had originally come from before Ashfen. A moment, late one night in the Ardenvale archives, when she had found a record that shouldn't have surprised her but did. A name, in faded ink, in a lineage she had no reason to have been looking at. Her mother's name, written in the Ardenvale records. in a section she would need weeks more to fully understand. She closed the archive book carefully and sat for a long moment in the quiet room, with the candle burning low and the castle settling into its nighttime sounds around her. She was not, perhaps, quite who she had always believed herself to be. She did not yet know what that meant. But she understood, in the still and certain way she understood most true things, that she was about to find out. She closed the archive. She stood. She walked back through the corridor toward the warmth of the hall. And the question stayed with her, quiet and persistent, like an ember that had been waiting a very long time for the right conditions to become a fire.